Yeah, but he's not afraid. This little guy is just a monster. Comes to other stuff. He one time. How are you? He doesn't put him on. Well, so they come out again. But they come and trying to play with him. Well, he doesn't. All three of them. You know, a moose.
Long.
Moose.
Yeah.
After that, she
Oh, boy.
yanked him back, pulled him back around.
Well,
it's either he has no hair.
you were in a good place.
Yeah.
He goes. So I got watching. He goes after one of these days. First, that's one thing. The dog was like, he just big old gash in his nose. Didn't learn his lesson. He still tried it. But he didn't. This guy. Well, actually, he was not so. We kidnapped him about 4 years ago. My wife's a breast cancer patient, so that she's always hated cats. Afraid of cats. And she was like this adult. Give him a phone in hand. Solid black, and then like, you nuts! That dog's gonna ruin your house. It's gonna destroy your furniture. And then just about a year old, she took off work, take a year off, write a book about her cancer treatment. Needless to say, she went strictly going back to work every 3 months. During that time, the dog's home alone. I should probably just pick him up and take him. For a person that hated him, yeah, had such incredible. And so much medicine just attitude happy. Something different. Bring over alive. You know, you guys film. He likes you guys better anyway. You know, I've lost my dog. And that was hard. It's very close to his mom. And the dog. And he is truly. This is him. He's just so much fun to play with you, play and play hide and seek. Oh, this is just. And we don't have kids are all grown. He's a doctor. They're gone. We have no grandkids. That's our grandkid. Keep teasing him.
Yeah.
About once every couple weeks. As a blue. Steve, you go. But see if I can take care of him home for the night. Oh, that dog is so. He loves it. Sure. And he loves to go flying on the tree. And he's terrific. Second, the grandkid picture. Your mom. Like that. He's not 12.
No.
so much. I mean, they're definitely
That's obviously discovered.
most.
Why is there any how some deeper everyone was standing around with how are you guys?
Yeah, he's handling a case on right now. The guy ran into my airplane. I didn't see minutes in the last couple of weeks. November. Where you going? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's so like ours, you know, it's you had a version of more help. First to say that over. Yeah, you know, they think that out. We did that with something else. You know, I don't know why. Do it with the
reason they supplied that was because of the couple of old businesses in there on David Cent. The last ones that were ready were 2 weeks ago, and the minutes 2 weeks ago. That was only such a short time. But yeah. Load my software up, start using this.
What?
Gotta load my software up.
Yeah.
Using it. That's an MP3 player. It holds about 6 hours. 6 hours. That's it. Yeah. USB port. Also record. It's called Spygadget. Spygadget.com. Because it's also a digital recorder, so you can record your meetings. Yeah, it's really cool. They're about 180. No.
This is the Thursday, April 9th meeting of the Zoning Board of Examiners and Appeals. Will you call the roll, please?
Freitas?
Here.
Hars?
Here.
Souza?
Here.
Ron?
Here.
Cross? Richard?
Here.
Marsh?
Here.
Van Torn? Big?
Here. That gets us to the approval of the minutes. We have, did we have the minutes? Did we have, oh, okay. There were no minutes from last week's, or from 2 weeks ago's meeting for approval. So that moves us down to special orders of business disclosures. Are there any disclosures for this evening? I do have a disclosure. I intend to recuse myself from case 2009-048. It's the last case of the night. I know one of the, I believe, potential buyers of the lot, as well as I believe one of the tenants are related to my partner in one of the units, so I intend to recuse myself from that case. Is there any objection to my recusal from the board? Any other board? Okay. With that moves us on to item D, consent agenda. We have 2 cases before us on the consent agenda. Is there any comments regarding the resolutions before us for approval? I do have one question of staff regarding Resolution 2008-014. This, I believe, is before us again for correction, Mr. Barrett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
And I noticed that at the time, I believe, of the original, that the original variance passed, there were actually 2 variances that were granted. Subsequently, the Ide Street variance was taken out and not necessary, or where I'm going with that is there's still on the second page, number 3, a reference to the secondary front yard setback along Ide Street, and that's no longer the variance that's before us. Is there any need for that item to be on here, or does it confuse the resolution?
Mr. Chairman, what I had done incorrectly on the version that you saw last November was I had combined 2 and 3 into one number. So it appeared that there were only 4 conditions instead of 5. I've gone over the language with the applicant, and they seem to agree that 3 is necessary. There was a little bit of confusion about where the setback should be measured because Ide Street is not fully developed and had a jog about halfway down the applicant's property. But they were satisfied with the language. I can check if you've got some concerns.
Well, my only concern is the resolution before us has just referenced the setback along Benson. So
2 references Benson, yes, and then 3 is Ide.
Correct. However, the resolution itself in the heading is only a 10-foot setback along Benson Boulevard. At the time that it was before us, I believe that we had there was a setback along Benson, and then there was the Ide Street as well. So
you're correct, Mr. Chairman. The title block is deficient. So if I can do it without bumping page and you're able to sign it, I'll just add that into the title block and we'll be done with it.
You're going to have to use a really small font.
I can go down to 8. Thank you for pointing that out.
All right. Are there any other comments? For the record, Mr. Van Flyne has shown up.
Good evening.
With a nice tan, it looks like. Are there any comments, or if there aren't any comments, could I have a motion regarding passage of the items? Well, thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Been moved and seconded. Mr. Burkhart has moved. Mr. Freitas has seconded. Is there any objection? Seeing none, those 2 resolutions pass. That brings us, we have no appearance requests before us, no unfinished business. There's nothing on the regular agenda. That moves to our public hearings. We have, on our agenda tonight, we have 4 cases. One of those cases has been postponed indefinitely, case 2009-039. the petitioner Louis and Panna Gerussi, a variance for an encroachment into the required yard setbacks. The site address is 10661 Hour Road. If anyone here tonight intends to or wishes to be heard on that case, that has been postponed and will not be heard tonight. Before we go into our individual public hearings, I would like to read the order of business for variances. The chair will introduce the case. The board will hear and rule on any objections to the sufficiency of notice. The board will hear a brief presentation outlining the case, not to exceed 10 minutes. The board may then question the staff. The applicant will give his or her presentation, not to exceed 10 minutes. Throughout the proceedings, the burden of proof rests on the applicant to convince the board by a preponderance of evidence that the variance should be granted. After the applicant's presentation, the board and the staff may question the applicant. The staff will have an opportunity to rebut the applicant's presentation, not to exceed 3 minutes. The board and the applicant may then question the staff. The applicant will then have an identical opportunity for rebuttal. The hearing will then be open for public testimony. Each person has 3 minutes. After the public hearing, the staff, followed by the applicant, have the right of rebuttal. Then the matter rests with the board. The chair will ask for a positive motion from the board. With that, that brings us to our first case tonight. The case is 2009-049. The petitioner is Kevin Meyer. Is the petitioner here this evening? I am, sir. Thank you. Can we have the who will be presenting this case from staff? Mr. Barrett, can you provide the sufficiency of notice, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 105 public hearing notices were mailed for this particular item. We had about 14 or 15 responses in support of the application, none in opposition, no comment from the community council, and the property was advertised and posted with a public hearing sign.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Will you proceed with your presentation?
All right, thank you. This is a request for a side yard setback, and if I could go through a little bit of the zoning background first by referencing the as-built on the stamped page 2, you'll see Mr. Meyer's property, and on the upper left-hand corner of his property is a shed with an attached lean-to, and the words side yard handwritten in on the north side and in the alley on Mr. Meyer's property. I point this out because it poses a definitional challenge for Mr. Meyer. Under normal circumstances, when a shed or a garage or any type of accessory structure is adjacent to an alley, it has no setback. However, the definition in the code specifically states that a shed or a garage or such in a rear yard adjacent to an alley has no setback. And since Mr. Meyer has a corner lot, by definition, he has no rear yard. So he is caught with two situations, the north side yard setback and the alley side yard setback. The department is talking to the people doing the Title 21 rewrite and considering changing the language so that any lot line, when adjacent to an alley, would not have the setback. It would seem unfair to penalize a property owner when they're adjacent to an alley, but because they're also a corner lot, they also have 2 side yards and therefore 2 setbacks. Nevertheless, at this point in time, it is an issue for this specific variance, and Mr. Meyer will have to address those items. Then on stamped page 3, you can see an exploded version, expanded version, enlarged version of Mr. Meyer's plot plan showing the existing shed and lean-to and how he proposes to expand it if the variance is granted. Regarding standard number 1, there exist exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstances, and those circumstances are not applicable to other land in the same district. The the standard is partially met. There's nothing physically deficient about the lot in terms of size, shape, streams, slopes, etc. The problem for Mr. Meyer in this case is that he is adjacent to an alley, but he does not get to take advantage of the setback because it's not a rear yard, it's a side yard. Unfortunately, corner lots and lots with alleys behind them are not unique. It's a common feature of subdivisions from the 1940s and 1950s. However, it's not truly part of the standard. It's not truly part of standard number 1, but it is a mitigating circumstance, and we'll talk about that as one of the other standards. The existing shed doesn't have any fire separation issues, and the shed and the lean-to were built prior to 1986. So they would qualify under the non-conforming section of the code, 2155, but because Mr. Meyer wants to demolish the shed, keep the foundation, and then rebuild a modern and enlarged shed, he's losing his non-conforming rights from the pre-1986 construction, and that's why he's here tonight. Regarding standard number 2, because of the physical circumstances, the applicant would be deprived of common rights of enjoyment. Again, partially met because of standard number 1 not being fully met and not really, the lot not really experiencing a true physical hardship. However, moving the shed would destroy it. It is on an extensive foundation, and it does have a significant below ground level, and there are some photos in the package of that. Furthermore, sheds, garages, carports, and other accessory structures are very common throughout this neighborhood, and they are up adjacent to the alley. So to say that Mr. Meyer could not have a shed in that location would, to some degree, be denying him the common rights of enjoyment. Standard number 3, the hardship is not self-imposed. That standard is substantially met. The physical features, Part A of this standard, are not truly fully met. However, the fact that Mr. Meyer has this unusual definition problem and the fact that he has no rear yard does contribute to this standard being met. And Part B of that standard, the applicant did not plat this property. He did not build the original structure. He has applied for a permit ahead of time. It's not a retroactive issue. And the existing structure is pre-1986 and would qualify for a favorable non-conforming determination under 2155-040. Regarding Standard 4, the variance, if granted, does not adversely affect adjacent properties. That standard is met. Fire has looked at it. The street maintenance people have looked at it. Drainage has looked at it. There do not seem to be any issues impacting either the alley or adjacent properties. And again, shops, workshops, sheds, trash containers, etc., are common in this neighborhood along alleys. Standard 5, the variance, if granted, is in keeping with the intent of the code and does not change the character of the zoning district. That standard is met. This is purely a dimensional variance for a common feature such as a shed. Standard 6, the variance does not adversely affect health, safety, and welfare. That standard is met. Again, no fire separation issues. Drainage does not appear to be a problem. No concerns expressed by the neighbors. And standard number 7, the variance is the minimum variance that will make possible a reasonable use of the land. That standard is partially met. Reasonable use would be for a home and a garage as exist. Without the shed, the property could be said to be at parity with the neighborhood, although sheds are a common feature in the area. Again, the shed and the lean-to are pre-86 and would have non-conforming rights. That is something of an extenuating circumstance. And further, it isn't really possible to minimize the location or the size of the shed because it is on a significant foundation. However, as 3 of the standards are only partially met, the department cannot recommend for approval. However, should the board find for approval, there are 2 conditions on page 9 of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Are there any questions by the Board of Staff? Mr. Freitas.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Barrett. In looking at the photo, appears to be about page 21, although they're both marked page 20, but the color one with the subject property outlined in red in the middle. Okay. Am I looking this correctly in that the property directly across the street to the right appears to have a shed all the way up to the alley with no setback? The property on the other side also appears to have a shed all the way up to the property line or alley with no setback. And I'm noticing a half a dozen or more right within the same vicinity that all have that same situation. Is that true?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Freitas, yes, it is. It's a common feature, and based on the age of the subdivision, I would suspect that they qualify under 2155 as nonconforming properties.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions of staff? Seeing none, would the petitioner come forward, please? Could you state and spell your name for the record? And you have 10 minutes to address the 7 standards.
All right, thank you. My name is Kevin Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R. Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on my variance request. As a way of introduction, my name is Kevin Meyer, and I live at the subject property at 1436 Garden Street in one of Anchorage's first suburbs, the lovely Airport Heights neighborhood, home of the infamous Snowzilla. I've lived in the municipality of Anchorage since 1977 and have been a homeowner, starting with a house on the lower hillside, migrating to the upper hillside, then Goodwood, and now since 1990 at the Garden Street location. After all these years, I'm nearing retirement, and over the winter I began exploring the idea of expanding a shed in my backyard to accommodate a personal hobby of mine, which is woodworking. In the course of that exploration, I began to research into construction and building requirements of the municipality for that action. And much to my surprise, I soon discovered that my property had a number of setback code issues. In January, I began a process of trying to resolve those issues and submitted an application to the planning department for determination of non-compliant status on my property. Because the house and the garage were constructed in 1951 and 1952, 2 issues were immediately resolved and now have legal non-conforming status. The shed and the lean-to, which were built in approximately 1981, were not granted that status at that time. I have one more issue to resolve on the property, and that is a fence line encroachment. I will be submitting a request for an encroachment permit as soon as the snow melts and I can obtain photos of the fence, sidewalk, and street configuration as part of the request application. What brings me here tonight is my request for a variance on the shed building. Since my hope is to expand the existing structure to accommodate a wood shop, I'm seeking a variance for the 3-foot side yard encroachment of the shed adjacent to the alleyway that runs between 15th Avenue and DeBar Road. The expansion of the building would be to the east into my property and respectful of the appropriate side yard setback requirements to the north and other municipal construction requirements. As you are aware, the shed is constructed on an 8-foot deep cinder block foundation and poured concrete floor that limits its ability to be moved or cheaply removed from the site. I know that I must substantially meet 7 standards to receive the variance. I have reviewed the findings of the planning department in my variance request, and rather than restate my arguments on each of the 7 standards, I would prefer to comment only on those that the planning department felt I only partially met. These are standards 1, 2, and 7. And with the board's indulgence, I would like to reserve my comments on the first standard until last. So let's look at standard 2. Standard 2 states that the strict application of this code would require an exceptional or undue hardship upon the property owner and deprive the applicant of rights commonly enjoyed by other properties in the same district under the terms of the zoning ordinance. If you look at their comments, you'll notice that they did find that the standard is partially met. The planning department concedes that moving the shed would create a hardship. and that similar structures adjacent to the alley and in side yard setbacks in the neighborhood appear to be common. Denying the variance, I believe that denying the variance would create an undue hardship considering the cost of removal or moving the shed, especially in terms of its long-time occupancy on the site. And that occupance is clearly in character with the surrounding neighborhood. Written comments from my neighbors, Mr. Gardner, Ms. Kurtz, Ms. Atwell, Ms. Bettina, and Mr. and Mrs. Valquez all provide support for these statements. I would argue that this standard is substantially met. Issue number 7, or standard number 7. Standard 7 states that the variance granted is the minimum variance that will make possible a reasonable use of the land. The planning department found that that standard was partially met. I think the question at hand is the definition used to determine what is reasonable. The planning department states that a reasonable use of the land is provided by the house and the garage. Yet it also allows that sheds are a common feature throughout the neighborhood. I would argue that an equally valid interpretation of reasonable use would be the continued utility of a structure that has occupied this site since the early 1980s. I would also argue that it's reasonable to upgrade a 28-year-old structure to meet the present needs of the owner-occupant, and that such an upgrade reasonably complies with the character of the existing neighborhood where numerous property improvements are occurring each year. And I ask, isn't that an indication of a healthy and viable community where people are investing in improvements of their properties to enhance the quality of their neighborhood? Isn't that what pride of ownership is? And isn't that what makes Anchorage such a great hometown for us all? I would argue that this standard is substantially met. Finally, standard number 1. Standard number 1 states that there are exceptional or extraordinary physical conditions or circumstances of the subject property, and goes on, that are not applicable to other land in the same district. The planning department found that the standard was partially met. I concur that there is nothing physically deficient about the lot. I agree that there is a definitional problem regarding the property because it is a corner lot. In essence, I'm in a situation where a previous owner didn't properly interpret a confusing set of municipal regulations. Clearly, they did recognize that there was a need for some setback, and the structures are set back at least 2 feet. And that would have met the appropriate setback requirements if this wasn't a corner lot, and they had a backyard rather than 2 side yards. Maybe to them they assumed that they did have a backyard, because it essentially functions as a backyard on this property. Maybe, in constructing the bomb shelter-like basement, they weren't really too concerned about setbacks. Unfortunately, we'll never know why there wasn't an additional 3-foot setback. In this case, I think there are several factors that should be considered in meeting this standard. Number 1, the shed and the lean-to do predate 1986. So most likely they have non-conforming rights. Under those rights, these structures could legally continue to occupy this site for another 28 years. Number 2, there are no fire separation, no safety, no traffic, no city maintenance issues associated with the structures as they now stand. Number 3, 11 neighbors submitted letters in the form of no objection to the variance, or even stronger support for the variance request. This includes the neighbors of the adjoining property to the north, those that would be most affected by it. And to my knowledge, there were no letters against or objecting to the variance request. Number 4, other structures, very, very similar in type and in location, exist throughout the area, and in part define the character of the long-term residency of people within this neighborhood. Number 5, there's a relatively small area affected by the variance, approximately 48 square feet. And 6, there is a history of variances being granted in the local neighborhood for situations such as this, even those including corner lots. And I know for a fact that one was granted on the next block south at 1560 Garden Street. Because of these factors, and the fact that I have substantially met the other 6 standards, I hope that the board will find that I have met the intention of the code and will grant my request for a variance. In closing, I would like to thank the staff of the Planning Department, in particular Ms. Irma Cox and Mr. Alfred Barrett, for their professional manner and helpfulness and their helpful attitude in helping me understand the intricacies of the municipal code, for helping me submit the appropriate paperwork, and hopefully for helping resolve this issue in a manner that meets the intent of the code, that intent to protect property values, neighbors' rights, safety concerns, and the nature and character of this local neighborhood. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Are there any questions of the applicant by the board or staff? Thank you. Staff, do you have any comments on the
No, sir.
applicants?
Thank you.
Thank you. That then brings us to the public testimony. Is there anyone here tonight wishing to testify with regard to this case? Anyone at all? Seeing and hearing none, the public hearing closes. Does the applicant, do you have any rebuttal that you, without any public testimony? But you're more than willing to offer, or offer you the opportunity.
I heard Al and he mentioned...
Could you come speak into the microphone again, if you would, please?
I'd just like a clarification on the public response, written response. Can you just let us know how many... I know a lot of people responded as no objection.
Specifically, I'd have to count them again, but when I go through the numbers, I think there were 13 or 14. Whether it's in support or no objection, I lump them into the same category.
Right.
There were no negative.
There were no negatives. Okay, I just wanted to be clear on that.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. With that, the matter rests with the board. May I have a positive motion, please? Mr. Freitas.
Actually, I had a question for staff.
I'm sorry. Okay, Mr. Freitas.
Mr. Barrett, understand that the main issue here really is the definitional confusion. Other than that, is this a case that you would have felt very comfortable in approving had it not been for the multiple side yard and definitional problem?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Pierce, I'm not certain what you mean. I would have had no trouble approving. I mean, a more favorable staff recommendation?
With the exception of the definitional confusion on this within the code, is that the only thing that you truly see that would prevent you from wanting to approve this case?
Right. Mr. Chair, Mr. Freitas, yes, if everyone would take a look at stamp pages 2 and 3 again, Mr. Meyer's as-built and his proposal. If Mr. Meyer takes down the lean-to, he doesn't have the north side yard setback because he's 5 feet, and if the side on the alley were a rear yard, there would be no setback, and Mr. Meyer would not be here tonight. We'd have been done with it.
Thank you.
I guess I need a little clarification, Mr. Barrett. I thought that under the proposal he was going to be taking down the lean-to with his extension of his shed, and that what I'd heard from the petitioner was he was taking down the lean-to, and that would give a 3-foot setback to the property line. The new shed was not going to encroach into that 5-foot setback.
Mr. Chairman, I've had several conversations about with Mr. Meyer regarding that. I didn't want to tie him into having to remove the lean-to if he wanted to pursue it. Okay. If you see it up close, it's integral to the shed. It almost looks like it is the same unit. So I wanted to give him the chance to make his argument for shed and a lean-to, or just shed.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Are there any, I guess, additional questions before we move on? Yes, Mr. Burkhart.
If possible, I guess I'd like to ask the petitioner to clarify whether or not he intends to remove the lean-to.
Mr. Meyer, would you step forward again, please?
I think I would prefer to separate the two issues and have a separate motion made on the two issues. I'm not sure I will actually do the construction, and I don't know when exactly I will do the construction to replace the shed. So I would like to have a motion made to allow me to retain the shed and the lean-to, and then another motion made to accept the variance on the shed with the removal of the lean-to. Is that possible?
Yeah, Mr. Burkhart.
If I may, I think this whole variance request is triggered by increasing the size of the shed, and that it is grandfathered, so there really isn't any action necessary from this board that I'm aware of for you to retain the existing shed and the existing lean-to in its present configuration. The thing that triggers you requesting this variance is adding on to the shed.
When I talked to the people, the municipality would issue a building permit, they said if I made any modifications to the shed, they wouldn't issue me a building permit that would allow the lean-to. So if I went in and wanted to do reconstruction on the shed, that they would deny, because if it's a non-conforming status, my understanding was that all you can do is a very minor improvement on a structure that's in non-conforming status. And so unless I'm granted a variance, I have no guarantee that the lean-to could continue to exist on that site if I make modifications to the shed.
Could we have staff respond to that as well, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Burkhart, a little clarification from where the permit folks would be coming from. If you look at the plot plan, what Mr. Meyer proposes as the expansion, generally speaking, if he leaves the existing shed alone and it is only an expansion in a conforming location, they would issue a permit for it. The problem for Mr. Meyer is he needs to rehab the existing shed. He wants to modernize it and then fit it together with the expansion. That's what's causing him to lose his grandfather rights.
And Mr. Barrett, is he allowed to do, I had thought that they could do up to 50% of the work without losing grandfather rights. Maybe I'm thinking of a different section of the code on when those rights are lost.
Mr. Chairman, the way just off the top of my head, the way the code reads is if the applicant or a volcano or an earthquake or a fire destroy more than 50%, then the grandfather rights are lost. But a property owner is allowed to maintain a non-conforming structure to 10% of its value per year. And if he can keep it going forever that way, it's grandfathered.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Burkhart, was your question answered, or do you have a question?
I think my question was answered. I agree with the staff's recollection. That's my recollection also.
And staff, we had the petitioner ask if it would be possible to separate out the two, I'm just trying to collect my thoughts, having the shed and lean-to, and then the shed and the expansion. Is that what you were asking again, Mr. Meyer?
Yeah, I'm willing to separate the lean-to from the shed, so I guess it would be one motion granting me a variance for the shed and the lean-to, and separated from a motion that would grant me a variance for the shed, but would specify that the lean-to would need to be removed.
And Mr. Barrett, with what's been advertised, is that?
It's perfectly acceptable, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thanks. So, thank you. So we'd need a motion. That'll be up to a board member to make that motion. Are there any other questions of any of the board, of staff, or the petitioner? Seeing none, the matter rests with the board. Could I have a positive motion, please? Mr. Ron, thank you. Could I have you
Certainly.
state
In
the
the
motion?
case of 2009-049, petitioner Kevin Meyer, I move to approve a variance from AMC 21.40.040 and AMC 21.45.030 to allow a shed to encroach approximately 3 feet into the required 5-foot side yard setback. Actually, if I could amend that motion, I would like to address the combined statement that's requested in the packet to allow a non-conforming shed and lean-to. So let's address that item first.
Could you cite your code, the AMC code citation again? Maybe I misread.
Certainly, there appears to be some discrepancy between the agenda that I was reading from and the staff packet. As reported in the staff packet on page 1, AMC 21.40.040, Section G. Make that motion with consideration of the staff's recommendations on page 9 of the staff packet.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. And just for my own clarification, I guess, was that motion for the shed and lean-to?
Correct, Mr.
That was, okay. With that, I want to check what the advertisement was. If we've got a discrepancy between the agenda, I want to make sure we're okay with what's been advertised. What page is the...
Mr. Chairman, what was advertised was for a shed to encroach the yard setbacks, very general. We try and keep the legal ad a little more open.
Okay, so what on the agenda, we don't have a problem there with...
Correct, sir.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ron. Mr. Burkhart has seconded that motion. Mr. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do, of course, intend to support the motion, finding that this being a corner lot and causing a definitional problem, and as a corner lot creating a peculiar situation, I find that standard 2 is met. I similarly find that, that addressing standard 1, find that standard 2 is met in that not allowing the reuse of the shed or pad would be an undue hardship. Substantial foundation and work associated has already been completed. There's no sense to require the undoing of that work in order to move the shed. As far as standard 7 is concerned, I do find this is the minimum variance allowable given that moving the shed is slightly unreasonable, and agree with staff's recommendation on the other standards.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. Mr. Burkhart.
I agree with Mr. Ron in that I think all 7 standards are substantially met here. I would also offer that I agree with staff's mentioning this to the Title 21 rewrite in terms of the specific definition here of side yard. Likely didn't take into account a corner lot. It seems reasonable to me that this petitioner should have the rights to build an accessory structure up to the alley, that every other inboard property on this block can do this, and just by virtue of the fact of having a corner lot being a side yard on the alley, I think is something that was, a fine point of the code, and that's what this board is here for, to interpret the intent of the code in this case. So I plan on supporting the variance request.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Is there anyone else wishing to comment? Any other board members? Mr. Freitas.
Yes, I would like to also add to Mr. Burkhart's comments that also the property directly east and directly west also appear to have the sheds or garages directly up to the alley, and they're both corner lots as well.
Thank you, Mr. Freitas. Seeing no other comments, please vote. That motion passes by a vote of 8 to... Would the absent be a no? Is the absent a no? Oh, 8 to 0. That motion passes. With that, is there still the need for, or is there a desire of any of the board members to make a second motion?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I believe the language in the original request here on page 1 of the packet was broad enough that I think it covered both the shed and the lean-to. And so I think, and we can ask Mr. Ron, but I think his intent was to cover the both and not split the motion. So I think that the variance for both aspects has been passed.
I agree with that.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Burkhart, that was my intention. Perhaps if we could ask the petitioner if they're satisfied with the motion as it stands.
Yes, I think that covers both the lean-to and the shed, so that's everything has been covered with that. I do need to read, any party aggrieved by this motion, by this decision, has 30 days to appeal to Superior Court. The third-day appeal period commences to run upon mailing of the written decision. That brings us to our next case, which is 2009-046. Is the applicant Eric Gieser in attendance? He is. And whose case is this?
That's mine, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Altour. Could you provide us with the sufficiency of notice, please?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. 104 public hearing notices were mailed out. 1 was returned in opposition, and 6 were submitted in favor. You should have received a supplemental packet with comments that came in after the packet had been printed. You also received, I believe, colored photographs that were submitted with this. This is a request. If you turn to page 25 of the packet, you'll find the as-built of the property. And essentially, it involves 2 features of the site. It involves an existing front deck that is roofed. The shed, the roof was added a few years following the construction of the single-family home, which was constructed in 1972. And the records from property appraisal show that first identification of the shed with a roof on it first appears a few years later. So there are no grandfather rights adhering to the front shed. He is proposing to enclose, the porch. He's proposing to enclose that to make it a covered, closed entry in approximately the same size. So the variances number 2 and 3 are addressing the front porch entry. So one is approximately 2 feet wider than the existing to allow for changes when he does that construction. The other peculiarity has to do with the shed located in the southeast corner of the property. It involves variance number 1 is a request to approve a 6-foot separation between the accessory shed and the principal structure when 10 feet are required. And the other has to do with the siding of the shed in relationship to the side and rear lot line. The property, as I pointed out, was the house was constructed in 72, and the carport was enclosed in 1977, making it an attached garage to the single-family home. In 2005. The shed was constructed by the property owner without benefit of a building permit. He obtained an encroachment permit from Chugach Electric to allow the portions of the shed to be within a 10-foot utility easement that runs along the east side of the property. He removed a portion of a rear deck, taking it out of the utility easement. And so the rear deck is less than 30 inches in height and is not an issue. The topography of the site is uneven in that this area of the neighborhood is somewhat rolling and sloping. However, this property had an unusual change in elevation in that corner, which was causing drainage problems to his property, to the, in particular, to both the garage and to the home. So, as part of wanting to correct that and needing an accessory shed, he attempted to solve both problems by constructing the shed in its current location. The lot itself has legal nonconforming rights with regard to lot depth. The depth of the lot is 81.75 feet in depth and does not meet the 100-foot depth requirement of today. And the reason for that is that the plat was being finalized and was being processed under different code requirements and was finalized and recorded in July of 72. So within the subdivision of Tall Spruce Estates, 19 of the 29 lots have the same legal nonconforming lot depth. So that is not the usual for subdivisions today, or in fact subdivisions within the area in general. The elevational difference in that corner is approximately 10 to 12 feet. And originally he intended to attach the shed to the to the principal structure. However, in doing that, it would have created drainage issues on the lot to the south, Lot 14. And so he, in consultation and agreement with the owner on Lot 14, placed the shed where it is, you see it, constructed retaining walls. As you can see on the as-built, there is a concrete block retaining wall that bisects the property east and west, and then there are spiraling lower retaining walls that go in a north pattern. So there is, I believe, condition number 1 has been partially met in that regard because it is unusual. It does not appear to affect the other lots. And there were both drainage and slope issues that had to be dealt with. With regard to standard number 2, the physical and platted circumstances did affect the lot. The placement of the house on the lot originally also left very few choices in where to locate it. The sheds, as we know, are accessory structures. However, this shed is on a ledge of land, a platform of land on that southeast corner.
Ms. Latour, you have a minute left in your 10 minutes.
We believe that one of the standards of measurement of a reasonable enjoyment of the property includes lot coverage. The lot coverage on this property does not exceed 26%. 30% is allowed. I would conclude by saying that we believe that the standards are met or partially met, and we recommend approval based on those findings and subject to standards 1 and 2 found on page 8. And I would also just note a correction on the wording of variance number 2. It says it's a 20-foot rear yard setback. It is, in fact, a 20-foot front yard setback.
Thank you, Ms. Latour. Just a quick question that I had. Tonight must be my night to look at our advertisements, how the cases are advertised. Are these cases typically advertised just for a setback? Because I see what's been mailed out talks about 3 variances, one to allow less than the required 10-foot separation between principal structures, one to allow a deck to encroach into the required 10-foot rear yard setback, and one to allow a shed greater than 150 square feet erected in a side yard. I don't see anything regarding the front yard setback encroachments, either existing or proposed.
That is the wording on number 2. The shed is in the front, is encroaching into the front yard.
No, I understand that, but what was advertised?
It was the 10-foot separation between the structures, the encroachment into the rear yard setback, and the encroachment into the side yard.
So my question is, can we act on the
Yes.
front yard setback?
Yes, you can act on that.
I guess it's just from my own clarification then, how are we able to, I see the request that was sent out on the public hearing is just a request for an encroachment into the required yard setback. And I apologize for beating a dead horse, but is that kind of is that along the lines of what Mr. Barrett was stating on the previous case, is that sufficient for us?
Yes, it's a generalized notice that allows, as we as we analyze the request, it allows the more specific statement or restatement of the amounts of the variances being requested.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Mr. Freitas.
Yes, I've got several questions I'd like to ask staff, if I could, please. Number one, I thought I heard you refer to it several times as a shed, but we're actually talking about a sizable barn. Is that not correct?
No, that's not correct. It is an accessory structure. You can call it a shed. You could call it a...
Mr. Freitas, there was a case that was postponed, and that, are you looking at, we're on case 2009-046.
Oh, apologize.
So maybe...
Never mind my question then. Thank you.
Mr. Ron.
Thank you. Through the chair, Ms. Autor, could you provide interpretation on or comment on right-of-ways comments for the subject case and whether or not that has any bearings on the department's recommendations?
Yes, I can. Their comments have to do with they identify the fact that there is a 10-foot utility easement, and what they're basically saying is for structures to be located within a utility easement, you need to obtain an encroachment permit from the utility. The petitioner does have that. It is in your packet. The second thing he points out is that the retaining wall, there's I'm guessing about a 3-foot to a 4-foot portion of that retaining wall is constructed in the right-of-way. That's not something that is the purview of this board. It is an issue that can be resolved either by obtaining the encroachment permit from right-of-way, or he can remove that portion of the retaining wall.
Thank you. If I could follow that up through the chair, does the planning department see a need to change the recommendations then in the staff packet, given your explanation?
No, I don't.
Thank you.
Ms. Suzo.
Yes, I just have a quick question regarding the one objection you received. The way that I read the packet, it seems like that complaint has been addressed, but I would just want to make sure I'm not missing something as far as the fence.
Yes.
It is not really part of the variance as well. Is that right?
That is correct. And the reason it isn't is because the petitioner, when this was pointed out to him, has agreed and has given me in writing a statement that anywhere within the 20-foot front yard setback, he will reduce the height of the fence and or the gates to 4 feet.
Thank you.
So yes, I believe that's been resolved.
Thank you.
Mr. Burkhart.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow up that the item that the chair had, and I guess my observation is that looking at one of the public responses that the request as written is a very broad statement, and I think maybe this is I hadn't noticed this before, and I don't know if this is just for today, but under the legal and details is where it's very much more specific and has 3 items there, doesn't have the 4th. And I always thought that that description was a little bit more generalized than what we're seeing on today's packets. And so I think that's where his question was coming from. And so I guess my question is that, yes, we really go by the definition in the wording in the request rather than the specific verbiage in the legal and details.
That is correct, Mr. Burkhart, through the chair. The purpose of the legal ad is to give a generalized notice to the public of the types of variants that are being requested. When you have a simple one subject, shall we say, variance, let's say the height of a fence, that's pretty, clear what that's conveying. We're limited in the amount of space that we can have in order to do a legal ad, and yet we have to convey enough of a sense of what it is that is involved. So in this case, where you have an accessory structure that has encroachments into more than 1 yard, it would be perhaps not very understandable to the public if we go in the detail that we did on the cover sheet where we explain each of the variances.
Thank you.
Are there other questions of staff? My last question is regarding variance request number 3, to allow reconstruction of a front porch, Arctic entry to encroach 4.2 feet. When I look on page 25, the existing, I guess I haven't seen any drawings showing an Arctic entry, number 1. Number 2, the existing deck currently encroaches 2.2 feet. So where did that 4.2 feet come from?
Mr. Chairman, the application, essentially says they want to enclose the existing structure, the covered porch. But in order to do that, it may be that they have to put footings out a little bit further or extend the roof a little bit further, and so they've asked for an additional 2 feet. And I think the petitioner could expand on that.
Have they asked in writing? Is it in the packet somewhere?
Yes, it was part of the application.
I see it's on page 26, number 1.
Yes. The second to last sentence.
Thank you. Are there any other questions of staff? Seeing none, would the petitioner come forward, please? State and spell your name for the record.
Eric Gieser, G-I-E-S-E-R.
And you have 10 minutes to make your presentation and address the 7 standards.
Okay. First of all, thank you for this opportunity to come in front of you guys. And also I'd like to thank Albert and Mary Otter for helping me with the application process, and during the course of the last month or so, all the various questions I had, Mary's been very helpful. The staff report generally represents accurately the facts in this case. So going through each question, I would just refer to my response that is in your package, starting with page 26 through page 28. Those are my specific responses to the 7 questions. One thing I would like to emphasize is the one opposed, from how I understand it, the one opposed response from the mailers that went out, it was in opposition to my 6-foot tall fence and gate in front of the shed. And I had already talked to Mary previously before that response came back, and I said if that is an issue, I would be more than willing to cut that down to 4 feet within that 20-foot front yard setback. Furthermore, Mary brought it to my attention this evening that the right-of-way comments regarding the retaining wall within the street right-of-way, I believe it, from the as-built, it appears to be 3 or 4 feet. I didn't scale it, but it's something like that. I would be willing to remove that portion of a retaining wall. I don't know if you guys have the colored pictures in front of you, but a good photo of that is page 2, picture C. It's the picture that goes up towards, you see a fire hydrant on the street. I believe that small section of retaining wall is the retaining wall that they are speaking about, and I very easily could remove 3 or 4 feet of that and be within their right-of-way easement.
Our page 2, picture C, has a picture of a camper.
Well, if you look, correct. Look towards
right there in front of the camper.
that small little
With the snow on it, thanks.
It basically, that retaining wall starts from grade level, and as you go back east on my property, it gets progressively taller because the slope difference when you get back towards the eastern edge is approximately, 8-9 foot retaining wall because the grade gets more severe the farther towards the back of my property you go. And I guess I will reserve the remainder of my time for rebuttal or in case there's anything else I need to say later.
Thank you, Mr. Geese. Are there questions of the applicant? Mr. Freitas.
Yes, sir. If you were to remove part of that retaining wall, would that make that driveway unstable at that front part?
Well, it wouldn't make it unstable. I would just have, looking at this picture, basically what it would be, I would just have to remove the block, the keystone structure blocks, and then just with a bobcat or maybe even by hand, just try to make that slope as gentle as I could with gravel or grass or whatnot. But that area that is within that right-of-way, from what it appears from my as-built, I don't think that elevation is more than 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet. It would just basically go back to how it was prior to constructing the retaining wall. So I don't think it would be an issue.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for the applicant? I actually do have a couple questions. You didn't acquire a right-of-way or a building permit for the shed, correct?
No, sir.
Okay. And one of the issues that we're dealing with, well, there are the 7 standards, but if a building permit had been applied for, this probably you would have been aware that a variance was needed to place this shed in this location at that time. The other item is on standard 7. It's a fairly decent-sized shed. Actually, I'd consider it a pretty large shed that you've got there. I noticed there's on one of the pictures you've got a garage door and a man door on the front. So why exactly do you feel this is the minimum? This variance, if granted, would be the minimum possible use of the land. That's yeah. It was on your page 4, picture B, I believe. Is that correct? You got a man door and a garage door?
That's correct. For loading things in and out, correct.
It's a fairly large shed.
It's a good shed.
So I guess that's, we need to find all 7 standards are met. That's, I guess, one of the ones I'm wrestling with. Could you maybe try and help me out with that?
Yeah, I'm just trying to see how that is worded. But I think that goes back to, in response to that, it would go back to the lay of the land as far as the elevation change from my neighbor's lot directly to the south, which is lot 14. There's about a 10 or 12 foot elevation change. And I was getting, originally when I moved in, I was getting water, and when I pulled the carpets downstairs, there was mold and fungus because it had constantly been wet from the drainage from the upper street draining down into my garage and then into my basement. That side yard where the shed is now was completely unusable space. It was on a slope. I constructed a retaining wall over I think it was in 2003 or 4, to create, to alleviate the problem with drainage. Then the following summer, I wanted to utilize that usable space that I just created, and that's when I built a shed. I was unaware that the shed needed a permit when I built it, but evidently it's over the minimum size requirements that the shed is bigger than the minimum requirements, so I needed a permit. At this point, the shed is on pilings, 4-inch pilings on that leveled area. So I guess the most reasonable use of that land is to put a shed on there because I built a retaining wall, and the shed is there. So I guess it's just the minimum variance that I'm requesting because the shed is already there.
Thank you. And the one last question, could you, I had asked the question of staff as well, the need for the front yard encroachment of 4.2 feet. Your application, you had stated to expand it an additional 2 feet.
Sure.
What's the configuration of that Arctic entry that you're
indicating? Sorry to interrupt. On your pictures, page 2, pictures A, B, and D, that shows the existing covered entryway. If you look on either side on the corners of that shed, I had 4-inch pilings with brackets installed at those immediate corners in line with the existing front porch. My plan is to, and you can see where I've removed some siding off of my house to see what elevation a beam needs to be in order to set in that piling bracket. I originally was going to ask for, I'm going to put a 4x12 that is going to extend into my house at the sill plate line there underneath the insulation through that piling post bracket. Originally I was just going to go to that existing porch. I need to go beyond it a couple inches to put a joist there at the leading edge of my 4x12 beam. And in doing this application process, I was kind of led to believe that if I asked for 3 or 4 inches is what I need in order to get my framing to work out, that I would be better off asking, or just as likely to be granted 2 feet or 2.5 feet. So that's what I did there. If that does become an issue, I am more than happy to not get the additional 2.5 feet and just go beyond that piling bracket enough to get a joist in there. It doesn't necessarily have to be 2.5 feet.
Thank you. Are there any other questions of the applicant? Mr. Burkhart.
Do you intend to get a permit for the enclosing the front porch there?
Yes, sir. And also, I'm going to get a permit for the shed also. That's part of this process.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Does staff have any questions of the applicant?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. With regard to standard number 7, being the minimum variance, can you discuss the participation of the lot owner on lot 14 with locating the accessory structure where you have, and how those changed or did not create or impact drainage issues on that adjoining lot?
Okay. The lot directly to the south, I believe is lot 14. They drafted a letter in your package, page number 29. That's a letter from that neighbor directly to the south. When I first had planned to or wanted to build a shed, I wanted to attach it to my house in some fashion, to my garage, just make my garage bigger. With the slope problem I ran into, the only way to utilize that section of my property was going to be to construct a retaining wall at some point in some area. One option would have been to put the retaining wall on or as close to my property line, my southernmost property line. It's build that retaining wall directly between lot 14 and my lot. The problem with doing that is the way the retaining wall is engineered is you have to excavate well beyond the higher elevated ground has to be excavated beyond, because you put in dead man anchors and all kinds of anchors to support that retaining wall, which I would have had to go into my neighbor's property by, at least 7, 8, 9, 10 feet, and I didn't think that was a nice thing to do as a neighbor, so I talked to my neighbor, told him what my plan was, and he said, yeah, he didn't have any problems with it, and that's why it was done the way it was done.
Does staff, any other questions?
That's all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Does staff have any rebuttal?
No, sir.
Does the applicant, do you have any questions of staff? No. Sorry. Okay, with that, the public hearing is now open. Is there anyone wishing to testify tonight regarding the case? Please state and spell your name for the record.
Sure. My name is Ron Dennison. Last name is spelled Denison. I live at 6800 Tall Spruce, which is Block 1, Lot 1, catty corner to Mr. Geiser's property.
Okay, you'll have 3 minutes.
I'm sorry.
You have 3 minutes for your presentation, Mr. Dennison.
I did not respond in writing because I think I felt that it's my duty to come down here and talk to you directly. Mr. Geiser has taken what is, not arguably, it was the worst property in our entire neighborhood and turned it into something that is absolutely decent. And his plans for further work there certainly have the approval of myself and my family And I think, as you saw, most of the neighbors in the neighborhood, if not all of them, if they even chose to respond. So my purpose in coming up here today is to ask you to approve his variances because they improve our neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dennison. Are there any questions of Mr. Dennison? Seeing none, thank you very much. Is there anyone else wishing to testify tonight? Anyone else? Seeing no one, the public testimony is closed. Does the applicant, you have rebuttal time? Do you care to offer any rebuttal? No. He has indicated he does not. Staff, would staff?
I have nothing to add. Thank you.
With that, the matter rests with the board. I'd like a positive motion. We have the 4 variances, so I'd request we probably need to address them one at a time, but I would like a positive motion, please. Thank you, Mr. Burkhart.
I guess I intend to take all the variance requests together
okay.
rather than separately. In case 2009-046, I move that we grant a variance from number 1, AMC 21.45.030B to allow a 6-foot separation between principal and accessory structure when a 10-foot separation is required, a 60% variance. Number 2, AMC 2140.030G to allow an existing covered front porch entry to encroach 2.2 feet into the required 20-foot front yard setback, an 11% variance. Number 3, AMC 21.40.030.G to allow reconstruction of the front porch Arctic entry to encroach 4.2 feet into the 20-foot front yard setback, a 21% variance. And 4, AMC 21.40.030.G to allow a 475 square foot accessory structure to encroach 3.6 feet into the required 5-foot side yard setback at the greatest point of encroachment, a 72% variance, and to encroach 2.9 feet into the required 10-foot rear yard setback, a 29% variance, subject to conditions 1 and 2 on page 8 of the packet.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. And Mr. Vig has seconded that motion. Mr. Burkhart, would you speak to your motion, please?
I intend to support the variance requests. I agree with staff that standard 1 is met. The lot is slope affected. The drainage had an effect on a number of the variance requests here. And we hear that part of the request for variation or for the variance request we're also in accommodation with the property owner to the south. I take that into account. In standard number 2, I agree with staff that that's at least partially met. That strict application of the code would deprive the applicant of rights in relation to the covered front porch entry. If we were going to remove that, that essentially that would make that front entry so small that it wouldn't be usable. The existing drip line on that front porch looks like it actually drops on the deck, and I could see the request to enlarge that additional 2 feet. I think it's essentially de minimis in nature in relation to the front yard setback. I think in terms of variance request number 1 for the separation between the principal and accessory structure, I think we have in our conditions here that the petitioner needs to apply for a building permit for the shed, and that the 1-hour separation upgrade to the garage and shed, if required by the fire department, I think that meets safety concerns. And as I mentioned, in regards to variance request number 4, that they have coordinated with his neighbor on that and found an accommodation. So I think standard 2 is met. Standard 3 is met in that the variance requests that apply to the drainage are special conditions given the topography of the land. Standard 4 is met in that I think we've had quite a bit of testimony, both Mr. Dennison, who showed up here tonight, and the other neighbors, in that the improvements that have made to the project, to the site and the building, have had a beneficial effect on the neighborhood. And so we haven't had any testimony that this would adversely affect adjacent properties. Standard 5 is met. I agree with staff. Standard 6 is met. I think our conditions here with the permits and possibly the 1-hour firewalls address the health, safety, and welfare. And I think standard 7 is met, even though that is a rather large shed. Once again, the property owner has coordinated with the property owner adjacent to that, and that person has no difficulty with the construction of the retaining wall and the shed. So I'm supporting the variance request.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Mr. Vig.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also concur with staff's findings and those of Mr. Burkhart, and in particular with standard number 1, I think the slope is a critical physical circumstance that limited the options available to the applicant here, and secondly the lot depth measurement of 81.75 feet also serves to limit the ability to address some of these issues to make reasonable use of his property. And in particular, number 4, with the public comment that was received by the adjacent neighbor and Mr. Dennison coming tonight, I think speaks clearly to the fact that it does not adversely affect adjacent properties. And then finally, the standard number 7, I think, although the shed may be large, I think given the fact that it's existing, that the variance requests that are before us tonight are really the minimums that will allow that to continue and to make reasonable use of the property. And so I concur with those findings and intend to support the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Vig. Is there anyone else wishing to comment? Ms. Souza. Oh, Mr. Van Flein.
Yeah, my comment is this. I intend to support the motion, but I wanted to be clear. We're approving, isn't part of this variance we're approving oversized shed as well?
No.
No?
No.
Why not?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Van Flein, because the code does not limit the size of an accessory structure that any lot owner can have. They're only limited by the lot coverage requirement of 30%. So any combination of footprint, if you will, of the structures are allowed by code. So they're not limited in the size, only the height of that accessory structure.
Okay. For some reason I thought, and maybe I'm mixing apples and oranges here, that under 2145030 there was a 150-foot square foot limit on an accessory structure, or am I getting something confused there?
If I may, Mr. Chairman, that portion of the code is basically saying that sheds of 150 square feet or less are permitted within the yard, the rear and side yard setbacks without regard to what that encroachment is. If it's larger than 150 square feet, then they're required to have the variance as we've put it to you this evening.
That's what, okay, that goes back to my question then. Aren't we approving also a larger shed as part of this variance? Because it's 400 square feet.
Well, I think the size, it's regardless of it's over 150 square feet, so it requires a variance.
Okay. And that's why it's encroaching, is what you're saying?
Yes,
okay, so
exactly.
We're talking two sides of the same coin.
That's correct.
Got it. Okay. I intend to support the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Van Flein. And Mr. Freitas.
Just wanted to clarify, too, that item number 4 and the request for variance specifies out that square footage, so it is including in there it's 475 square foot accessory structure to encroach into the required setback. So stipulating the size of that structure, which is well over the 150 feet, so it is kind of spelled out in there as well.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to testify? Anyone else to speak to the motion? Seeing none, please vote. That motion passes. A vote of 8-0. Again, any party aggrieved by this decision has 30 days to appeal to Superior Court. The 30-day appeal period commences to run upon mailing of the written decision. That brings us to our last case of the night, and I think what I'd like to do is maybe take a very short break, maybe no more than 5 minutes, and just for the record, I will be recusing myself from this case. Mr. Van Flein, as Vice Chair, will be taking over. But we'll be back in a few minutes.
Yeah. I can just sit here, can't I? Yeah. Just leave your stuff. Actually, yeah.
So should I ask you to log out and come back in and see if that'll take the change? Because if this works, you should get a box where you can control. What can I do? I don't know what to do. According to Granicus, this should work. Let's start voting. Why would you not have request to speak? Well, no,
Well, that's
I
my
don't mean,
request.
no,
That's it.
yeah, you did exactly what, no, you should have a block that shows who has.
All right, I'll
requested
move, I'll
speak.
move.
Yeah, I'm afraid we're gonna have to. But you can't be logged in two places. Okay.
Move.
Yeah.
It's funny, I was reading that wrong packet. It was like, it juices the dough. Much of it was what kind of, between the curve balls, she said, recommended approval, but this was really recommended denial.
Yeah, that one was
Wake up. How can that be so old, a resolution like that? Show up. Oh.
Yeah.
Ah. Yeah. So is it, are you seeing this actually encroaching into the neighbor's yard? Where are you at?
It doesn't in this debate. The chairs are like that, maybe. Although you see the little ponies.
And they enclosed into a garage, so one got an added roof on and notice on. Wow. You look at the place where there's like accessibility. Notice it.
Okay. Ready to go? All right. Okay, we're back on record. Our next case before us is case 2009-048. The applicant is Meta Jane Osborne, and this is a request for a variance in the R2M districts, a variance from AMC 2140-045G. Right now, what I'd like to do is find out if there's any objections or questions regarding the sufficiency of notice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 118 public hearing notices were mailed for this item. One was received in support of the application. Two were received in opposition to the request, both suggesting that the lots be replatted, and we'll discuss that under standard number 7. The property was advertised and posted with a public hearing sign.
Okay, thank you. At this point, Mr. Barrett, will you be presenting the case?
Yes, sir.
Okay, please proceed.
Thank you. The as-built for the subject property is on the page stamped number 3, and it's labeled at the top subject and lot 6. On the page stamped number 4 is the lot right next door, lot number 7. That is the property that's being encroached upon. It's not technically part of the variance, but because of the type of encroachment, we asked Mrs. Osborne for as-built on both properties so it could clearly be seen what the issues were. And it is not an as-built, it's a cut and paste from the as-built, but on page 49, stamped page 49, you can see the two properties side by side. It'll give you a little bit better feel of some of the things we'll be talking about. Mrs. Osborne owns a legal duplex that was built in 1963 and has a legal but non-conforming carport built in 1966, which is now an illegal garage converted from the carport in 1989. This might sound a little familiar to a case from 2 weeks ago where a carport encroaching a side yard was converted to a garage. It's not deja vu. It is a very similar case all over again. The enclosed carport, I'm just going to refer to it as a garage right now because it is really a garage. The garage now encroaches the full side yard setback, all 5 feet, and actually crosses onto the neighboring lot by a distance of about 5.5 feet. It had originally encroached that neighboring lot by 8 feet, but was cut back during a certificate of occupancy inspection by the building department. And when we start looking at the as-builts in detail, I'll mention a couple of things there. Let me just go straight to the standards, as it's getting a little late for me. Standard number 1, there exist exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstances, such as but not limited to streams, wetlands, etc. The standard is not substantially met. The lot is long and narrow, but it is a legal lot, and it is typical of plats in the 1940s and 50s. It's also typical of lots in the subdivision. in looking at the as-built on page 3, if you put your finger over the right-hand side of the building on top of the driveway and on top of the building, you're blocking out what is now the garage, and you can see what was the original house approximately. The lot is the house is 42 feet wide on a lot that is 53 feet wide. So even if the house had been placed up to one of the lot line setbacks, there still would not have been room for a garage. It seems apparent that a garage was not anticipated on this property, or at least back when the house was built, pre-code, no one was anticipating that there was going to be an issue. Because the house is set back almost 46 feet from the front yard lot line, there would have, at the time or even now, probably been adequate area to install something of a garage in the front yard, but it's not the logical location, and it would not tie into the house in any appropriate manner. So we don't consider a front yard garage a reasonable alternative to what could have been done. That probably belongs more under standard 7 than under number 1. But I pointed out because it is related somewhat to the shape of the lot, long and narrow, and the fact that the house took up most of the buildable area at that time. Nevertheless, because there isn't anything physically unusual about the lot, standard number 1 is not met. Standard 2, because of these physical circumstances, the denial would create an exceptional or undue hardship. That's partially met, partially because there are no known physical issues with the property. However, also partially met because garages are a common feature in the neighborhood. So are carports, for that matter. Further, the common remedy in a case like this, as was the case of the property 2 weeks ago, the usual remedy would be to recommend that the garage be reconverted back to a carport, simply returning it to its non-conforming state. However, as in the case 2 weeks ago also, you still have the same footprint because we're looking at an aerial on the roof down. The encroachments would still appear to be the same. This really is a variance because a carport has been converted to a garage. The yard encroachment is and has been there for several decades. Standard 3, the hardship is not self-imposed. This standard also is partially met. Again, nothing physically unique about the property. For the second part of the application, it's a pre-existing condition. Mrs. Osborne did not build the carport nor convert it to a garage. She didn't plat the property. This is all a situation she purchased and which was not pointed out to her at the time. We've not been able to locate a permit for when the carport was built. However, there are some notes from the building department in the package that do point out the yard encroachment and that a certificate of occupancy for the carport was issued in 1983. When the carport was enclosed in 1989, no permit was located, there's no variance on record, and it is that enclosure which has created the current violation. Returning the carports returning the garage to a carport is really just an inconvenience or a monetary hardship, but you'd still have the encroachments, and looking down on an aerial photo, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Standard 4, that the variance, if granted, does not adversely affect adjacent property. The standard is at least partially met. Parity already existed with the house and a carport on the property, so adding the garage is what causes this problem. But it does not negatively affect the adjacent property. There are no fire separation issues, no drainage issues, and the owner of, or excuse me, I'm not certain if he's the owner or if he is a buyer with a pending contract on the lot that is encroached upon, and that's lot number 7, does not object to this variance. For standard number 5, the standard is met. This is purely a dimensional encroachment. It's a 100% encroachment, but it is just dimensional. Standard 6, the variance, if granted, does not adversely affect health, safety, and welfare. That standard is met. No fire separation issues, no drainage issues, no complaints from the neighborhood. And I should touch a little bit on the fire separation issue and the history of the property so that it's more easily understood what went on with the property back in the 80s when the carport went in. If you take a look at one of the drawings where the two properties are side by side, either on 47 or 49, where lots 6 and 7 are side by side, if you look at the deck on lot 7, which is the lot on the right-hand side, there's a deck on the front where the driveway joins the house. You can see that that deck has been cut off at an angle. On the other lot, lot 6, where you can see the 5.4-foot encroachment of the garage, that's the encroachment that used to be 8 feet and is now only 5.4 feet. When a permit and a CO were done back in the early 80s, it apparently was issued in error by the department, and there may have been an issue of estoppel if someone had wanted to bring it up. But the compromise that was made at the time with the building department and the owners of the property at the time was cut back the deck, shorten the encroachment onto lot 7 so that there is a 10-foot separation between the two buildings, and the city would overlook the fact that they had issued a permit in error. So I just wanted to make it clear that there's not a fire separation issue for this property. Regarding standard number, and furthermore that it is permitted and does have a CO. Regarding standard number 7, that this is the minimum variance, the standard is partially met. It is a 100% encroachment and in fact does go across the property line some number of feet. A reasonable use of the property would have been for the house and carport as existed in 83 and which were issued the CO by the municipality. However, is it minimum? Yes, it's been there for many years, and replatting the property, as was suggested in 2 of the letters of objection, replatting is often an option, but not in this case. If you take a look again at one of the drawings where the two properties are side by side, in order to replat the properties, you would either, 1, have to zigzag the lot line back and forth between 6 and 7, and it would cause some encroachments on lot 7. You'd actually be cutting off a portion, a tiny portion of his driveway at the northwest corner of the driveway, and you'd be cutting through the sidewalk walkway that he has on the west side of his house. That's on lot 7. Then, in order to compensate for his loss of property, you'd have to zigzag the new lot line back onto lot 6 so that they gave up some property to lot 7 so that both lots maintained their legal minimum size. I hope that's clear, but it indicates to me how complicated a replat would be, zigzagging the line back and forth between the two properties. One of the letters of objection said that the two lots should be replatted into one. That does not address the issue. It is an option because this is R2M property and allows multifamily, but the building and the lot line would go away, and there is no fire separation issue between the buildings. But in the R2M zoning district, in order to have more than one principal structure, you must have 1 acre of land, which Ms. Osborne does not have. So we do not see a replat as an option on these properties, and therefore standard 7 is at least partially met. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
At this time, I will see if there are any questions from the board or staff. Mr. Freitas?
Yes. Looking at that picture, there appears to be a flat roof garage with considerable overhang. Has cutting that back some to reduce part of the problem been considered or discussed? And if so, what were the results of that discussion?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Freitas, no. Separately, the roof overhang's not been discussed. Normally, roof overhangs are allowed a 2-foot encroachment, so into a yard setback, and the encroachment is measured from the wall of the structure. So in this case, cutting the roof overhang back doesn't materially change what the violation is.
Ms. Suzo?
Yes, I just want to make sure that the difference between a carport and a garage question that came up 2 weeks ago still remains, right? There's no difference under the code definitions, as far as we know. That, short of what you can. So if we say that they should go back to a carport, they can't go back to a garage simply because of the modification aspect of the provision.
Right. Mr. Chairman, Ms. Fuso, right. The violation is first that a non-conforming structure was modified. It was changed to a garage that costed its grandfather rights. Then, because it is now a garage, it's also got the 5-foot encroachment. We have to add that part in. Taking it back to the carport would return it to its original legal but non-conforming state, but the encroachment is still there because in terms of the yard setback, there's no difference between a carport or a garage.
Just one follow-up. So the footprint is larger. It's 5 foot. It causes that 5-foot encroachment. Is that right? The footprint of the garage versus the carport is larger.
No, ma'am. The footprint of the garage and the carport are the same.
Are the same.
It's just been enclosed.
Thank you.
Mr. Burkhart. Mr. Barrett, and I guess I'd also want to hear comments from the lawyers on our staff here. Is this legal for us to approve this?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Burkhart, it is legal for the board to act up to the lot line. The crossing of the lot line is a civil issue, and the way the approval, the two conditions on page 13 are written, I hope to address that. We're talking about a 5-yard encroachment, and then Ms. Osborne and whomever she sells lot number 7 to are going to enter into an agreement, both acknowledging that there is a 5'4", 5.4 foot encroachment onto lot 7, and then we're going to require that that be recorded with both properties so that future buyers and sellers of both 6 and 7 will know there is an issue. So yes, it is, because the zoning board's not actually saying bless you to the 5.4 encroachment. It's just the 5-foot encroachment on Mrs. Osborne's side of the property.
And so, yes, the part that's going across the property line, that's really not the purview or responsibility of this board.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Any other questions for staff? Mr. Barrett, I have a question for you. Looking at page 61 in the packet, there's a picture of the house with just the carport and before it was converted to a garage. If the variance is not approved, my understanding is it cannot revert back to that status. That was a non-conforming status, but the whole, all encroaching portions at that point would have to be removed?
Mr. Chairman, no. If she has to remove the garage, technically she probably could never return it exactly to this carport because of the age and because of the amount of construction that went into creating the garage out of a carport. Nevertheless, we would say if she can return it to a carport, we'll consider it to still be the grandfathered piece of equipment. But again, still the same footprint, still the same encroachment.
Okay. Any other questions for staff? Seeing none, if we can call the applicant, you have 10 minutes to discuss the standards with us.
Okay.
And particularly, you might want to focus on the first standard if you could, since that's the one that the staff found lacking.
It seems that the primary issue here is that the original carport, which was extended over the property line by 8.1
Could you get a little bit closer? I'm sorry, ma'am.
Became 5.4 feet, and then a garage door was added. So that seems to be the problem. Okay. The date seems to be the issue as well, in that if it were before 1986, it would be considered an administrative issue. And the municipality has documentation showing that the door was present in 1989, and if I understand things correctly. So in addressing the standard number 1, the lot is no. Back then, I guess that's what they were doing. But the footprint and the drain plane of that property has not changed. It's actually improved by trying to get it back into compliance by reducing the 8.1 foot encroachment to 5.4 feet, which to my understanding happened in 1983, which is pre-1986. That can be documented by the need for the duplex building permit on Lot 7 being issued and the angle on the upstairs deck on Lot 7, which I also own right now. So that seems fairly well documented. So again, we're going back to the issue of, by adding the garage door, did it happen before 1989, or did it happen right up at 1989, or could it have happened in 1986? The owner, Mrs. Meeks, who's now deceased, daughter and son-in-law actually built the duplex on Lot 7. So they were present during that time. They left the state in the fall of 1985 and have addressed an email to me saying that, no, that door was there a long time before we left, which would place it sometime prior to the end of 1985. That puts it in the pre-1986 issue where it should have been an administrative thing, not a variance thing, okay, as far as grandfathering. So, again, the original house was built in 1963. It was originally platted in 1952 and rezoned again in 71, I believe it was, and again in 85. So the historical aspect of the house being, and the carport enclosed garage being there, seems to be very long-standing with no complaints to the neighbors, no complaints ever that I'm aware of. And as I have been there since 2001 in the duplex next door. I knew Mrs. Meeks and I knew the Baldwins, and that brings up another subject in that I do need to correct an issue of, I always understood that Mrs. Meeks owned both lots and had them subdivided, and I found out since then that that's not true. The house that was built in 1963 and the subsequent carport that was built in 1966 were built by a person by the name of Noggle. So I stand corrected on that. So I'm hoping that that will help take care of standard number 1. All the rest of them seem to be partially met or met. So I'm thinking that that's all I have to say. I do need to add that Mr. Barrett has been just an exemplary person. He's helped be over and beyond what most people would do. He's really taken me out of the insane asylum and put me back on the street.
Okay.
So if there are any questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Are there questions for Ms. Osborne? These are from the previous ones, right? I'll ask it again. I'm sorry. Any questions for the applicant? Any questions from staff for the applicant? Okay. Okay, at this point, ma'am, you may sit down and staff can present a rebuttal. Mr. Barrett has none.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
may I ask a question of staff?
You bet.
Mr. Barrett, the petitioner has indicated that the garage was enclosed prior to 1986. If the existing carport would have been grandfathered and the carport would have been enclosed into a garage before 1986, that would be grandfathered also, and there wouldn't be a need for this variance. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Burkhart, that's correct. It would, either one would fall under the 2155-040 pre-1986, yes. And that could be done administratively.
Okay. And has the petitioner been advised that those grandfather rights disappear if we take action on this case?
No, I don't think we got that specific, Mr. Burkhart, because in effect, by turning it into the garage, she's already lost the grandfather rights for the carport. And I would have to just add a little to that. The best date we can find for the conversion from the carport to the garage is 1989. There's a clear photo from property appraiser records that it's a carport. That's not to say that pre-86 someone didn't enclose it, turn it into a garage, and then decide to remodel it and make it a nicer garage, and the property appraiser just happened to photograph it while it was back in its status as a carport while it was being renovated. We don't have anything that detailed. But for me, the bottom line on that is it's the same footprint, it's the same yard encroachment.
So from your standpoint, whether or not it was enclosed prior to 1986 doesn't have any effect?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Burkhart, that's correct. If we could clearly have established it was pre-86, we wouldn't be here. But in terms of why a variance is needed and going on our assumption that it's post-1986, it's the same yard encroachment, it's the same variance. It's the 5-foot encroachment.
Okay. I think you've responded, I guess, differently from when I first asked my question to the latter part. And I guess what I'm getting at is that I think it's critical in terms of whether or not establishing nonconforming rights would make this go away. And if we act tonight and find denied the variance request, then that has extinguished the petitioner's rights to establish those nonconforming rights with what might be new testimony or new evidence in terms of what she's related to us as email from the offspring of the prior property owner that now live out of state. And I'm not sure if that was examined when the nonconforming determination was made.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Burkhart, I'm not certain if Ms. Osborne got into that depth of detail when the nonconforming rights were being researched and written up, but I did, and that's kind of why I'm trying to steer you away from the pre-86. I'm not convinced that it is pre-86. And the letters from offspring, neighbors, even sworn statements stating that, boy, it was here when we moved away in 1984, that's, for us in establishing grandfather rights, that's not compelling enough evidence. We need something a little more substantial because memories are not infallible. So I really want to steer us away from sending her in that route. I don't want to go pre-86.
Okay, so you have heard that, and in your mind that wouldn't change the nonconforming determination?
if the variance is denied? Is that?
Right. If we were to postpone this, I guess what I'm concerned about is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that a nonconforming determination, the rights to a nonconforming determination go away once this board acts.
That's correct, but I wouldn't want to do it with a proviso or as a postponement that Ms. Osborne go back and try to establish the pre-86. I think we're just, well, justice delayed is justice denied. I'm not convinced. So Mrs. Osborne knows of this. She's been working at it. She's been trying to establish pre-86 rights for the length of time we've been doing this, and they're not there.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Question for Mr. Barrett. If the request were to be denied and the applicant were to seek to solve the problem by replatting, as was suggested by a couple of public comments, the solution would require a lot line to move the 5.4 encroachment plus the 5-foot setback requirement for a total of at least 10.4 feet to the east. Am I understanding that correctly?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vig, that's correct. I was scoping it out a few minutes ago. I didn't bring a scale with me, but if you look at the as-built on page 4, somewhere along that, the lot line would have to zigzag over the 5.4-foot garage encroachment and then another 5 feet, so you've got the yard setback. That puts it up to and possibly onto the driveway of Lot 7, and then when you zag it back to the northwest to go between the two buildings, you're going to be cutting across the walkway that leads up to the house on Lot 7. It would just be a bizarre situation.
Thank you. I suspected that may be correct.
Any other questions for Mr. Barrett? I actually have a follow-up question to something Mr. Burkhart was raising. Why isn't it possible for the board, if it was going to deny a variance, to do so without prejudice to an issue that hasn't really been directly raised?
Meaning the nonconforming rights?
Yeah, the pre-86.
Ms. Zorma Cox of Land Use does have her letter in here, and I'll have to refresh my memory with how specifically she discussed that. Ms. Osborne's letter, Mrs. Cox's letter to Mrs. Osborne is on the page number stamped 43.
And the response is on 62, 63, and 64.
All right. I'm quoting from Mrs. Cox's nonconforming determination. I think it might be a couple of places in the report. Property appraisal records indicate the original structure was an attached carport. However, sometime in 1989, it was converted to a garage. So that tells me right there that it's consistent with all the information we found. It's not pre-86. If you were to deny without prejudice so that she could come back so that she could pursue additional nonconforming rights, yes, I think you could do that. But then if the nonconforming rights don't work out and you've already denied the variance even though it's without prejudice, I think code has already overruled you on that by saying that unless it is a substantially different variance, she cannot come back.
Okay. Any other questions? Mr. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A follow-up question, actually, in regards to Mr. Barrett's response in reference to Ms. Cox's letter. For clarification, what is the evidence that Ms. Cox was relying on in indicating that the garage was, or the carport was enclosed at some point during 1989?
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Round. 2 places on page 059, there is a computer printout from when the evaluation of the construction was done back in the 80s and the building permit was issued accidentally or inadvertently. And then on page stamp 61, those two Polaroid photos are from the property appraiser records, and they were taken June 2nd, 1989, and they pretty conclusively show that the garage is only a carport, fairly substantial carport, but no evidence of a front door or a back wall being there.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. I guess in that top photo there on page 61, it looks like what I'm seeing is a garage door that's closed on the right side of the photo. Perhaps I'm misinterpreting it, but clearly on the bottom photo, there appears to be no garage door, at least one that's not closed, if there is one.
Mr. Chairman, for my part, I yield to anyone with 20/20 eyesight, but when Mrs. Cox was evaluating these, she would have been using a monocle to get up close and look. I'm going to have to assume that that's what she did.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Barrett? The applicant, I don't know if that qualifies as rebuttal or not, but in an interest of due process, if you have any comments to add to the new information that was brought out by myself and Mr. Burkhart, Mr. Ron, and Mr. Barrett, you can have a couple minutes to do so.
My goal is not to argue, but I perceive things a little differently. In Irma Cox's letter, down in the paragraph, municipal property inventory sheets indicate the structure was built in 1963, blah, 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 and then a photo dated June 2nd, 1989 shows the carport converted to a garage. So using the photos on page 61, where the top photo is dated June 2nd, 89, I think I just misspoke. I agree that the carport appears to be down because it's a 9-panel door. On the lower picture, which is not dated, and there is no door on that carport because you can see the light through it, be it poor. But to me, the photo dated June 2nd, 1989, and I agree, puts the garage door on it, but does that mean it wasn't there January 1st, 1986? I believe Mr. Barrett told me earlier tonight, and again, that photos are taken every 2 to 3 years. So if that's the case, if there's no other photo, you could take the June 2nd, 89 date and subtract 2 to 3 years, which would put it someplace between 87 and 86. Okay. So given that there's no history of other photos, and given that historical data during the 80s was somewhat scarce, it seems to me that it is a point of conjecture whether the garage door was there in 86, prior to 86, as the family states that it was. I've had the email, and I've had 2 emails, one from Al Baldwin, who is the son-in-law, and one from Irma Baldwin, who is the actual daughter. Al Baldwin worked for some real estate division of the state of Alaska, and I have to believe it, although, you know, he does get dates wrong sometimes. But I feel it's a point of conjecture as to the date that the door went up. I'm inclined to believe Irma, the daughter, who seems fairly sharp to me in my dealings with her in the past. I believe that I practiced due diligence by ordering a title report on this property as well, showing no encroachments. So I'd really like for it to be considered that the door may possibly have been there in 86, prior to 86, as stated by the family. Okay?
Okay, thank you, ma'am. And at this time, please remain. We may have some questions for you. Mr. Burkhart?
I appreciate your comments there. But in order for the city to give a non-conforming determination, they need solid evidence. And so whereas it might be conjecture that if there's a photograph that shows the carport enclosed in 1989, there's no solid evidence when that was done other than verbal or hearsay. I can see where there wouldn't be enough evidence for the city to find that that the carport was enclosed before 1986. That it would be, as you said, conjecture, and we couldn't rely on that to establishing those nonconforming rights.
But it seems unfair to me that it's not considered as a possibility.
I think there's possibilities of all things, but to establish nonconforming rights, you have to prove the nonconformity, and so in that respect, it's the burden of proof in terms of what you present or what the city can find, and I can see the city's standpoint that if there is no solid evidence, they can't grant nonconforming rights.
So if I have a document from Latco Construction saying the date that they put the door in, would that be adequate enough?
I guess I'm not staff, or I don't personally make those non-confirming determinations, and maybe that's something for Mr. Barrett to address.
Mr. Chair and Mr. Burkhart, sure, an invoice, a work order with something clearly dated, that's a little bit more conclusive than just a letter from a previous neighbor or owner who's remembering back many years. That could be worth pursuing.
But I do have one of those. I do have a letter from Irma Baldwin, who lived next door until late 1985.
Yes, ma'am. What I'm saying is that a letter from the people who installed the garage door, a work order that's stated, that would be much more conclusive.
Does it have to be original work order, or can it be from memory?
we could
because the possibility of keeping records for 26 years is pretty slim.
Ma'am, if I may, the standards that we apply, and I assume it would be the same standard that the city would apply, is what's called a preponderance of the evidence, which is generally defined as a 51% probability or greater. And so we would have to be able to look at your evidence and say it's more probable than not that the garage door was installed prior to 1986. There are a variety of ways to do that, and what you're talking about right now, what Mr. Barrett is talking about, is the quality of the evidence and how much you can rely on a memory versus a time-stamped document for a work order or a building permit or something that was contemporaneously recorded that you could say that's solid evidence that persuades me. You could look at photographs. If you compare the two photographs in your pictures here, you could have had an arborist say, well, I'm looking at the growth of the trees in both of these pictures, and that would take at least 4 years for it to gain 4 feet like that. Therefore, deducing that the tree growth behind the roof line took 4 years minus that from the picture that's dated in 1986, and you would get down to 1985. It would have to be that type of logical, sequential, reliable data for, I think, the city or the board to rely on. That's what I think we're trying to explain to you, not just somebody's memory of what happened.
I'm trying to find out what it is that would suffice, and it seems, again, I'm not arguing, but I just want the so to be over. It just seems like I agree that the 1989 photo is, it's documented, but I also believe that an owner's daughter who lived next door till late 1985, advanced overhead door, who put the door in and is searching for the receipt. I also believe that Latco Construction owner, who is now retired and living in Seattle, who knew the Baldwins, if you put all those together, it seems like it should suffice. But if it's not going to suffice, if it's just blowing smoke, then I have other things to do with my time as well.
I understand, and I suppose this is why Mr. Barrett said he'd rather not deal with this issue. But, for example, you can look for a serial number on a garage door and contact the manufacturer and find out when it was made and things like that, or on an overhead automatic garage door opener. There are ways to get more conclusive evidence to Mr. Barrett. That's why I suggest perhaps we just leave the issue, and if we deny your variance for the other reason, we deny it without prejudice, and if you can locate documents that can convince Mr. Barrett that, yeah, this garage door was installed pre-1986, I don't want to prejudice your right tonight if you haven't had time to do some of the things we've talked about. So maybe we can address that as a board when a motion is made. So are there any more questions for the applicant?
Can I add one thing?
Yes,
Can you
ma'am.
at least take the testimony of my buyer, who's very patiently waiting to take possession of Lot 7, so it doesn't inconvenience him to have to come back, if that's the case?
Yes, ma'am. That's the next thing we go to is a public hearing. So,
Okay.
thank you. Is there anyone here for public testimony? Please come forward and state your name for the record, and you have 3 minutes to address us.
Okay. My name is Ken McNally. Last name is McInally. I'm trying to buy Lot 7. And the garage on Lot 6 makes the house on Lot 6 more valuable. It's not in the way. The overhang, someone brought up the overhang, can't remember who, is not in the way. And that's about it. I don't really know.
Okay. If, there may be some questions for you, if you can stay there. Any? I have a question for you. If I understand your testimony, you're trying to buy the lot and you have no objections to granting the variance and you think it would be helpful?
Correct.
Okay. We do have a question.
And if you were to purchase the property, you would be willing to enter into the agreement that's one of the conditions of the approval of this request, that will be recorded against the property and the neighboring property?
Correct.
It acknowledges that the encroachment exists. And
Yep.
okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Can I just ask a quick question? Would you prefer to have the garage versus a carport?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Is my neighbor? I mean,
Your neighbor, yeah.
yeah,
Oh.
definitely. It increases the value, then the place is built bulletproof. That house was built with great big beams, and it's all tongue and groove. That place is never going away. It's probably built better than the duplex I'm buying.
Okay. Any other questions for? Okay. Thank you, sir.
Yep.
Mr. Barrett, any rebuttal testimony?
No, thank you.
Ms. Osborne, any rebuttal testimony to the public testimony? All right. At this point, the public testimony is now closed, and the matter now rests with the board. I am looking for a positive motion from someone on the board. Or I will select somebody. Nobody?
I would suggest it be one of the attorney types for adding that thing that you were talking about.
Oh, the
non-prejudice.
without prejudice?
Yeah, make sure that's worded right if you're going to do that.
Okay. Do we have any other attorneys left on the board? I mean, I suppose I could make the, I didn't know if the board, if the chair can do it, so that's why I'm looking at Mr. Burkhardt. Why don't you make a positive motion? I don't have anything up here. Oh, I see. I'm sorry. I'm looking in the wrong spot. Mr. Burkhardt.
I move we grant, in case 2008-048, I move that we grant a variance in the R2M district, a variance from AMC 21.40.045G, which requires 5-foot side yard east line setback from 21.55.040 to allow a carport converted to a garage to encroach 5 feet, 100% variance into the setback subject to conditions 1 and 2 on page 13 of the packet.
Is there a second for Mr. Burkhart's motion? Am I reading it wrong? I don't see.
It's off the screen. There's no button.
Oh. What do I do?
Tom, I don't know what happened. It switched to that and I can't get rid of it.
Had a motion?
I was even texting you saying Mr. Burkhart has moved. There's a motion up here and suddenly it's saying it's over inside.
Well, it thinks we have.
Bear with us. We're having technical difficulties.
Can you go backwards? Okay, now try your second again. Try it again. Okay, we're looking for it. There we go. Seconded. We'll turn it over to Mr. Burkhart then to discuss his motion.
So there has been a second?
There is a second.
Okay. I'll start with standard number 2 and go from there and come back to standard number 1. Staff finds that standard 2 is at least partially met. I would agree with that it's at least partially met. There are the rights commonly enjoyed by property owners is of a garage, a covered place for their vehicles. Standard number 3, I think that's also partially met in terms of the hardship is not self-imposed, that the work here was done by others previously, and even though that runs with the responsibility of later property owners, we take that into account. It's not merely an inconvenience. This is cases, I guess, very unique in my experience on the board in terms of actually having the physical structure cross a lot line, and I think it's also unusual in that the purview of this board is only considering the encroachment on the subject lot. But I would agree with staff that standard 3 is at least partially met. Standard 4, I think, is partially met also, that we have the prospective new property owner of the duplex next door. He doesn't see a problem with allowing the encroachment, and he's indicated that he will agree to record a document to that effect. So I think standard 4 is at least partially met. Standard 5 is met in that it's in keeping with the intent of the code, with our purview that this board is not dealing with the extension over onto the adjacent property in terms of allowing the encroachment here. We're dealing strictly with the portion of the garage that comes up to the property line. And in that rather narrow respect, I think that standard 5 is met. Standard 6 is met in that fire department has looked at this when the encroachment was discovered, they agreed to grant a certificate of occupancy. They would not have done that. There is enough separation between the two structures to maintain fire safety there, so I think that standard 6 is met. Standard 7, I think, is met in that, in any event, if the garage or the carport had been grandfathered, that what really triggers our action here is not being able to establish non-conforming rights to the enclosed garage. And in that respect, this is the minimum variance that grants the continued use of the garage. So that takes me back to standard number 1. And like staff, I really don't see, I would agree that I don't believe this is a substantially met, that the lot itself is rectangular in shape. The dimensions of the lot are identical to a number of adjacent properties. There's no slope effect, significant slope effect on these properties. And so I guess I find that 6 of the 7 standards are at least partially met, and it comes down to whether or not that's enough to grant that all 7 standards are substantially met in total. When our variance standards were rewritten and modified a year or two ago, the word substantial there was added, and I think that gives us the flexibility to define that we don't necessarily need to find that all 7 standards have been fully met. And I think I'm inclined, I'd like to hear from other board members, but at least at the present time, I think 6 of the 7 standards being substantially met, and the particular history in this case of the garage or the carport being built, permitted, and having a certificate of occupancy, that a replat being problematic and maybe impossible. I haven't taken a look at zigzagging the property line and whether or not that would be would result in conforming lots. But I would agree with staff that it appears to be a problematic issue, especially where the 2 adjacent structures are close to one another. If there's barely the 10-foot to get the distance between the existing garage and that deck, I think it's rather likely that there wouldn't be a property line configuration that would allow the property line to be reconfigured in a conforming manner. So overall, I'd like to hear from additional board members, but I think with 6 of the 7 standards at least being partially met, that substantially the case has been made, and I plan to vote in support of the variance request.
Thank you. Ms. Suazo?
Actually, she was pushing the button for me because mine wouldn't come
Oh,
up. So
okay.
If that's okay.
Mr. Freitas?
But I would like to speak to it. I agree entirely with Mr. Burkhart's interpretation on each of the standards. I, too, agree with staff that standard number 1, in fact, is not substantially met. However, as Mr. Burkhart pointed out with the rewrite of the code, that does give us the flexibility in unique situations, which I think we have exercised before, and this is certainly a unique situation. I think the thing that pushes me to be inclined to support the measure is the fact that while we're only granting the variance up to the property line, it's not going to be effective until a signed and documented recording agreement is in effect between the 2 parties of the adjacent property. So therefore, it would have to be provided with a complete understanding and agreement by the adjacent property owner for this to be effective, and that's going to go with the property. With that being said, I think that creates enough of a unique situation that I'm inclined to support this variance request.
Okay. Ms. Suazo.
I'm also planning on supporting this motion, and I also agree that aside from one, all of the standards have been substantially met, and that's why I will support it. But I think another underlying factor in my support is the fact that if to deny this motion would really, I think, fly in the face of the intent of the provisions of the standards and of the variance procedure in general, because what we would be saying is that we are ordering property back to a state in which it is less valuable and has a negative impact on the environment, on the neighborhood, and that's not something I'm comfortable doing, especially since we have a substantial support for all of the standards except for one.
Okay, thank you. Any other people who would like to speak in support? Yes, Mr. Freitas.
Yes, I would like to add one other thing just to strengthen. I believe Mr. Burkhart touched on it slightly too, is the fact that the documentation based on when the garage was actually enclosed is still a little unclear, and along with Ms. Suzo's comments about being unfair in a situation, I think if there was any tendency for that to have occurred prior to the 86, I would much rather err in the petitioner's favor rather than against it, because there is some cloudiness to that issue in my mind still.
Are you addressing the issue of ruling with prejudice or without prejudice?
Correct.
Okay. I think procedurally you should probably move to amend Mr. Burkhart's motion, see if it's a friendly amendment, that if the motion is denied, or if the variance is denied, that it be denied without prejudice to the applicant, providing new evidence to the city that it might qualify as a nonconforming for other reasons.
I would like to make that motion.
Okay. Is there a second to that motion? Yes, there is. At this point, then, we discuss the amendment, and maybe we'll start with Mr. Burkhart if he considers that a friendly amendment or not.
I guess my concern would be that staff in prior cases has indicated us that that those rights do extinguish with a variance request, and so I'm not sure if this board has the legal right to add that motion. So I guess I would be interested to hear if Mr. Barrett has any opinion on that, or could at least verify that that at least in the past that the legal opinion has been that that those non-conforming rights were extinguished with the action of the board on the variance request, whether positive or negative.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Burkhart's correct. It would extinguish, but then on the other hand, do you have the authority to say without prejudice they can come back? That I just don't know. I've not seen this before.
Here's my thinking on it. We can, if we vote to make it a decision that is without prejudice to her rights to collect further evidence, we can do so. And if the city attorney says, well, that's fine, but the code says you can't do that, we're at least stating our intent, that we do not intend to bar her that opportunity. If it turns out the city attorney says it is anyways, all we've done at that point is state our intent, that by our voting tonight, up or down, we don't intend, as a board, to prejudice her rights to collect other information that might be another avenue for her. And it won't be our decision to decide whether it, in fact, will or will not. That can be made later.
With that explanation, I guess I will accept this as a friendly amendment.
Okay. then I think procedurally it is officially amended. So, okay, back to the main motion. Are there any other people who would like to discuss the main motion in favor or against the variance? Okay, there are none. I would like to make one comment. I agree with Mr. Burkhart, Ms. Suazo, and Mr. Freitas in the comments that they've made, and Mr. Barrett's presentation was excellent. I would add that under the substantial compliance test, I think it's also within our purview to weigh the evidence and to give more credence to factors that are more relevant and more important. And in that regard, when I look at standard number 5, and it tells us that the variance request is keeping with the intent of the code, and we all agree that that was met, that's a pretty important factor right there that helps outweigh something like not meeting or partially meeting standard number 1. And then having the new buyer say, I will accept this, and I agree to put on the public record as a limitation on the land, essentially, the permanent, this acknowledgement of this encroachment. That's also a very important factor that doesn't fit terribly neatly within any of these, but on a practical level is very important. And then there's a factor on, health and safety of the public. And I think we've discussed in other cases the value in a northern climate like Anchorage of an enclosed garage environmentally. And if we were to, say, take off that garage door and open it back up, it's a kind of a step backwards in terms of the environment and with the goals of Anchorage. So we would be, cutting off our nose to spite our face to make a technical compliance because of one factor, and thereby almost overriding the intent of the code and safety factors. So I think when you put it in the big picture, it makes sense to grant the variance, and I intend to vote for it. Does anybody else have any comments before we go to vote? Okay, seeing none. Do I do anything? Oh, I just have to vote. Okay. Okay, the votes have been cast, and the variance passes unanimously with everybody who is here. So I need to inform you that anyone who feels aggrieved by this decision has 30 days to file an appeal after a written decision has been issued on this. Let me go to the agenda. And we have reports. The chairman is not here, so he cannot give his reports. Are there reports from anybody else or any comments from the board members before we adjourn?
I'd just like to request, Mr. Barrett, why don't you bring us easier cases that you've been bringing too many head scratchers to us here lately.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. 2 weeks ago, Mr. Burkhart asked for some more plain vanilla variances. Keeping with our ice cream metaphor, the case that was postponed indefinitely tonight would have been Rocky Road flavor. But I'm hoping now that it's gone forever, so I'm doing what I can to find those plain vanillas, but it seems they're not there anymore.
Okay, any other comments from the board? Do we have our next meeting scheduled? Do you know? Next month, I guess, the second Thursday. Okay, great. We'll see everybody next month, and have a good evening. This meeting's adjourned.